making eye contact with someone to make them feel seen in that moment. If we're trying to talk, it adds more stress to the environment. They're probably not hearing you.
It's just being in that space with that person. All you need to do is help that person feel not alone in whatever they're going through.
I really worry with behavior that so much emphasis is put on the individual in isolation, whereas there's so much about the way our behaviors are shaped and learnt over time is based around that social interaction and how we've experienced that.
If you had a magic wand and you could impart one skill or piece of knowledge on every human, what would it be?
I had a lot. I was actually thinking about this. So I had lots of different things in my head.
Chelsea Troutman is a board-certified behavior analyst with a Masters of Education in School Psychology from the University of Cincinnati and a postgraduate degree in Criminology from the University of Melbourne. With international experience across government and community service sectors, Chelsea brings deep expertise in risk management, complex trauma, forensic behavioural context, and holistic strengths-based support for individuals with high needs. In this episode, we hone in on understanding behaviour in your relationship. Stay tuned. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. Can you talk a little bit more about, how we can do that reflection in the moment and why it's important?
Yeah, I think again, this goes to practice. It's really hard to say I'm going to do this and then do it. It's actually really hard. We have so many default patterns, right? And in a stress response, we're going to naturally activate default patterns that most likely aren't that adaptive, that aren't that healthy at times. So it goes back to that. It goes back to practicing. It goes back to practicing when I'm calm and retraining my body. It's retraining my nervous system. So it is really positive affirmations are great. Reminding yourself that I can be calm. Scheduling space in your day to breathe throughout the day. So not when you need it, but actually proactively planning throughout your day space to breathe and regulate your nervous system. It means when it's flooded with emotions, it's far more capable to access those new habits and strategies than when we randomly just decide in our head, I want to start using this strategy and I've never practiced it. Our body doesn't know it, doesn't recognize it. So it's really hard in that moment. So I'd say everything is about practice. Find opportunities to practice in a calm state, all these things. Practice breathing, practice positive affirmation, practice your sign that you're going to take a step away. Say out loud before things get really heightened, when you start seeing things unravel a little bit, say out loud, I'm going to take a step away. I'm going to breathe and then step back. So it's a somewhat unsettled phase, but everyone's quite capable of tolerating that at that point. And then you're setting the context of the room. You're setting the rules of the environment so everyone feels safe and knows, oh, I'm going to return. I'm going to come back in a safe way. I'm going to come back and be ready to listen. So I'd say it goes back to practicing. We have to shape behavior, and shaping behavior requires reinforcement. So we have to practice and we have to feel successful. And the more you experience opportunities of success where you can come back and have a conversation with someone, you're more likely to do it. So it goes back to the basic principles around behavior is shaping. We need reinforcement, practice opportunities, but it needs to be at early stages of behavior change.
What are some of those behaviors that you see in relationships that often have deeper roots in our childhood or past?
I think it's exactly everything we spoke about. Emotional regulation is probably the biggest one. Um, I would say emotional regulation and patterns of how we cope with stress and communication. I think those are really, really big patterns that have developed from early childhood. And that's because we're constantly influenced by the way our parents responded to our behavior, or teachers responded, or peers responded to our behavior. It teaches us how we feel about ourselves. Are we worthy of speaking up? It teaches us, are we more likely to avoid a situation because we don't like conflict? Are we going to step into a situation really heightened and reactive? Right? So our experiences really shape the way we cope. And it shapes how we experience stress and how we respond to stress and that emotional regulation. I love everything that's out for parents around co-regulation. And I think what's tricky is, and even if you think about from a relationship point of view, co-regulation is pivotal. It's across the lifespan A lot of people talk about it with children, but it's across the lifespan. We're always co regulating because learning occurs within a social context and we're social beings. So I really worry with behavior that so much emphasis is put on the individual in isolation, whereas there's so much about the way our behaviors are shaped and learnt over time is based around that social interaction and how we've experienced that. So I think one of the biggest things is emotional regulation, how we regulate. And I would say, again, across the lifespan, if we could all learn how to co regulate, and that doesn't mean I'm going to sit there and breathe hand in hand with my partner. It means I'm just going to stay calm. And I know when to be present. I know when to stay calm. I know when they need to borrow my calmness because they don't have the capacity in that moment. And I'm safe for them because I'm not going to run around. I'm not going to scream at them to stop. I'm just going to stay put and stay calm. And that's so important is recognizing that even if you don't have the skills in that moment, someone else in that social environment trusts me and they do have the skills and they're going to keep me safe. So co-regulation is huge. But that emotional regulation, that response to stress, I feel like that's definitely an entrenched pattern we've been brought up with through multiple experiences over time.
I'm so glad that you raised co-regulation because I know on social media there is a lot of myths out there around co-regulation and this, real concept and focus on hyper independence. And so I think people can get really confused about these concepts. So, obviously emotion regulation, we're talking about, as you said, doing those things that we need to do for ourselves. So taking a breath, and it's our responsibility to take care of our emotions. And also, we co-regulate in relationships. And there is so much misinformation around this idea that if you co-regulate, you are dependent on your partner. So there's, instead of being dependent, we want to be hyper independent as opposed to having that interdependency, which co-regulation is a key part of. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know I see a lot of content about this. There is so much misinformation out there. I feel like we just need to flood social media about this concept of co-regulation because I think it is just so misunderstood, unfortunately. And it's so important to understand why it's so important in our relationships and to our own individual well-being.
100%. I think where we start from is we have this culture of pathologizing stress. And I think we over pathologize it. So we assume when someone's stressed, there's something really, really wrong. But our bodies and our lives are stressful. They're not just generally at this baseline. That's life. Life is highly dynamic. We should be experiencing variation in our stress responses. That's actually really healthy, as long as it's not an extreme version. But having variation in our stress responses is really important. And so I do worry that we over pathologize stress as a mental health condition as opposed to recognizing that we are social beings and that we are going to have different stress responses. And that sometimes our resources that we use on our own work really, really well with us. Sometimes they don't. But I also know that I function in a social world. I function around others. And so I know that I might be calm, but if someone else is stressed around me, it will naturally activate my stress response. So it's really important to go back to the fact that we all have a responsibility together. If we want to create an environment that is safe, then we have a responsibility to pay attention to each other's behaviors, to pay attention to each other's stresses. And if one person is struggling, that's okay. We don't have to pathologize that as they have extreme mental health condition. It's actually they're just having a hard time. And I'm always going to show up with compassion first and say, I'm okay. I can give 80% right now. And my 80% means I'm just going to stay put. I'm going to create some safety in this space. I'm going to allow this environment to be a safe space for them to regulate. I'm not doing anything to them. I'm doing it with someone because we all have a shared responsibility in this environment. We talk about it in terms of partnership, but you think about a workplace. It's really important even within a workplace because one person's struggling, we're never going to allow them just to sit there and flounder, right? And then cause more distress within the environment. We know that stress stress can flood everyone. It's like a domino effect if something happens. So it can and somewhat be contagious, right? If I'm really stressed, I know my partner is naturally more stressed. I know that. I know that they are going to feed off my energy. We all know that. We live in a social world. So we absolutely have to recognize that if I have the capacity in that moment to regulate, I'm going to need to step up and be the one to create some calmness in this environment so that someone else can actually feed off the change in the environment. They can feed off the change in the energy. This is just behavior. It is purely behavior. Behavior is interacting with various stimulus in the environment, right? You're just constantly interacting with your internal world and the external world. And if you don't have the resources in that moment to regulate, you are going to naturally respond to the environment around you. And if the environment's really stressful, you're going to become more stressful. If the environment is naturally calmer, you are going to naturally calm. That's that is in its simplest form what we're talking about. I think with co-regulation, it's an intention. It's actually recognizing that this person doesn't have the skills in this moment. I do. And I don't have to do anything to them. I'm just going to be there with them because they matter and their safety matters.
I love that you're saying that because I think that that can be a reason that people don't lean in those moments is they feel like, "Oh, you know how to talk to people, you know what to say. I don't have that capacity to do that." But what we're talking about, as you said a number of times, it's just being in that space with that person. All you need to do is help that person feel not alone in whatever they're going through. And we don't need to say anything to help someone feel less alone. We just need to be there. It's just simply your presence, and so I love that you're highlighting that because if someone's listening and they're thinking, "Oh," which I'm sure everyone has been in that situation where they've seen someone overwhelmed, it might help them feel more able to step in and just hold some of that space with someone, knowing that they don't have to have the magic words. In fact, we don't want them to have any words sometimes. It's just about being with someone in that moment, whether that be your partner, a colleague, a friend, even a stranger, really. We can hold that space for someone who we see. It might be just saying hello or interacting with them, but just offering some form of connection so they feel not alone in that moment.
That's right. And we underestimate the ripple effect of even just eye contact, joint attention, just making eye contact with someone to make them feel seen in that moment. They're already struggling in that moment. They're already feeling a whole range of feelings. If we're trying to talk, it adds more stress to the environment. They're probably not hearing you. But if you get their attention first and you just breathe or you just sit down with them and you just be open to whatever happens is actually okay. Sometimes that's all that's needed is actually just to sit there. Turn off the lights if necessary. Turn off the TV. Maybe that's the actions. If you need to action something, maybe those are your actions. Is just actually reduce the stimulus. But just let them know you have nowhere else you need to be. They matter. And they matter enough for you to just sit there and hold space. And that's really tough. But it's really important to practice our own regulation of our nervous system so that we can actually be there for someone else or ask our partners and say, when I'm really flying off the handle, I'm really struggling, recognize I'm not trying to cause harm. I'm actually struggling. And I just need you to come in and maybe I just need you to hold my hand and that's it. That's all I need is just hold my hand and not judge me and say out loud, I'm not judging you, maybe. Right? But it is about having these conversations. It doesn't require a whole lot of terminology. It doesn't require a lot of strategies. It requires a motivation and intention to show up for someone else because they matter.
That's so important. I want to ask you, we've talked a lot about emotion regulation, and I think sometimes people can get confused about the difference between avoiding emotion and regulating emotion. Can you explain a little bit about the difference between those two things?
Avoiding, I would say, is a reaction to a situation. So it's a reaction to a stress response. So avoidance is normally occurring in the context of this is really difficult for me. It feels really uncomfortable. I'm afraid of this. And there's probably a whole story behind that, but it's a reaction to a stimulus. It's a reaction to a stress response. Emotional regulation is essentially, I would say it's the practice. It's actually trying to put in place specific strategies to tell your body, I am capable, I am safe. It's trying to increase maximum capacity in that moment. And so what it is I talk about approach goals in my work. And I never am necessarily talking about avoidance because avoidance creates residual risk. You avoid a situation, there's residual incidents or issues you have to deal with after the fact. You brush everything under the carpet, it still sits there. It's a big mountain under that carpet that you have to deal with. So there's a residual risk attached to that. Our job is about approach goals. Emotional regulation allows us to approach a situation in a very safe manner, step by step. You're not going to just lift the carpet and dive straight into that pile of rubbish, right? Instead, you're going to figure out how I can actually do one step at a time to approach a situation that's really difficult. And each step I take, there's a strategy to regulate my system to say, oh, I'm capable, I can tolerate stress, I can tolerate this trigger that's going to activate my stress response. I think what's really important with emotional regulation is it's actually breaking it down step by step. People want to jump to, I can regulate all my emotions. That is extremely difficult, right? And it's a
I just
constant.
want to say I can't always regulate all my emotions.
I
And
am.
we've been learning this stuff for years. Like, that is the reality. That isn't the end goal. We will all always have those moments, won't we?
That's right, and that's okay. That's actually life. That's what makes dynamic and fun, and we are social beings. So we are constantly going to be evolving. We should be evolving. But what it is about recognizing what do I need to approach this situation. So if I know new situations scare me and it's going to activate a stress response, then I'm more likely to plan in advance. I'm more likely to look online and say, okay, where am I going? I'm going to look and say, how many people are going to be here? I'm going to prepare myself in advance. I'm going to schedule time around that situation so that I know when I walk into it, I'm capable. That's emotional regulation. Preparing yourself for difficult situations is actually part of the process. Then, when I step into that space, I'm going to say, what do I need to feel calm just to walk in the door? Maybe I carry something. Maybe I wear something that makes me feel really comfortable or confident. Maybe I'm gonna walk in and go straight to the toilet so that I know I can get in the door, but I might just have to have an escape route at first. And then I'm gonna have a game plan for what I do there. I'm gonna practice breathing. So, emotional regulation is about being intentional and being purposeful and recognizing what are those situations that cause me more stress and what can I do to approach this situation in the safest way possible so that I can actually practice my response to triggers that I'm going to experience along the way. And when I talk about triggers, it's triggers that activate a stress response. And so I'm not going to go from 0 to 10. I'm going to say step 1 is this, and I'm going to manage this, and I'm capable of managing this. And step 2 is this. If we don't do the work to approach the situation safely, that's where you get avoidance, which is a reaction to an overwhelm of stress.
That's so helpful. I love how you broke that down because I think you're right. Like, people can go to this extreme of like, I'm going to be emotionally regulated all the time. I'm never going to have reactions, which we know is unrealistic. What role do you think self compassion plays in behavior change, both for ourselves and for those around us?
I always talk about compassion first, always, because there's always a story behind everything. There's always a story behind a situation, someone coming in saying, how was your day? "Ugh, yeah, it was okay." There's always a story behind that. We might interpret that as, they don't want to talk. They're not a good communicator. But there's a story behind it, right? So I'd say compassion first is I'm open to the situation. I'm inquisitive. I'm open to see where this goes. So being compassionate towards someone else is saying not just paying attention to the behavior, but saying, what have they been through? What have they experienced that have led to this situation? That shows that I have I trust them. I trust that they have been through something important or difficult. And again, I'm just going to be there for them. I'm going to listen. I'm going to show up. Compassion to ourselves is about recognizing our own personal needs. And I think compassion is so important to recognize that I matter. I am worthy of having my needs met. So, whilst I can show up and be compassionate for someone else, and I can help them in terms of shaping behavior and opportunity, it also shouldn't come at a compromise to myself. I shouldn't have to sacrifice myself in its entirety to fulfill someone else's behavior change. So I would say compassion to ourselves is paramount. So when we reflect on someone else's behavior, we have to say, well, how does this affect me? What are my needs in this situation? And that's where we have to show compassion to ourselves and say, I am worthy of this. I can communicate, even if this is a really hard discussion, I can communicate my needs because it matters and I matter. And if we don't come from that standpoint first, then we can't show compassion to someone else. Or worse, the person doesn't truly know the rule book. They don't know the boundaries. And so their behavior is constantly being reinforced. Their maladaptive behaviors or harmful behaviors are constantly being reinforced because we're not countering those in any way. And so it's really important. The compassion first for yourself is paramount. It's absolutely critical in a relationship because we have to be able to explain this is what I need. We have to remind ourselves I matter. I'm worthy of love and I'm worthy to have my needs met. And I'm going to do the work to listen if someone says that my behaviors are hurting them. So if I'm compassionate, I'm saying I can actually change my behavior. I want this to work within my relationship. So it's not just saying I'm worthy of having my needs met, but it's also saying I can actually change. I'm capable of actually working with my partner to create something really amazing where both of our needs are met.
I love that balance. It's so important, isn't it? Holding your own needs, communicating those, holding the other person's. And as you said, sometimes we do need to put a boundary in place. What would you suggest if you need to put that boundary in place in terms of your own needs?
Obviously, it's different if it's a safety issue. So I would say address safety first. Absolutely. Physical, emotional safety, psychological safety, absolutely handle safety first. That is paramount. In a general context, I think boundaries are really important to recognize yourself, what triggered me. It's recognizing behaviors that have occurred and saying, okay, what led to this situation? Reflecting with yourself. Because I think, again, it goes back to recognizing what are those triggers that precipitated the behavior? And then what is the story behind those triggers? Where did that come from? Why was that such a trigger for me on that day that it led to this behavior? And so once you can work out those triggers, then you can work out and say, actually, this is what I need. So those triggers don't keep occurring. So I don't keep reacting to the situation. Ideally, it's about recognizing this is really important. I don't want that to keep happening. So this is what I need. I need you to say this in advance. I need this to be done. I think those are the boundaries. This is the line in the sand. This is what I can tolerate. This is what I can't tolerate. If this happens, this is what I'm going to do because I have to look after myself first and I need to walk away and breathe. So I think it's really about that self-reflection that's really important at that point. And that's what will give you the information to recognize what are my boundaries? What are my personal needs? And how am I going to respond? And then I'm going to explicitly tell the rule book to someone else. I'm going to tell them my boundaries out loud because I'm worthy of that. It's really important that I feel I'm worthy of someone hearing those boundaries.
You do highlight a really important point because one of the things that can come up a lot on social media in the comments is this won't work for me because I'm in an unsafe relationship. That's not how the person is explaining it. But essentially that's the reality of what's happening. And obviously, there is a big difference between those two contexts. And so much of the information that we're putting out there, we're talking about in the context of safe relationships, where, yes, there may be unhelpful behaviors, behaviors that we don't like. We might have unmet needs. But we know that when we go to address those situations, like conflict may escalate, for example, but we know that we're never truly unsafe. And so I wanted to ask you because I know you have so much expertise, obviously, in this area, and there are people that will be listening to this thinking, I wish I could do that, but that's not the case in my relationship. What would you suggest to someone who is listening to this and starting to recognize, hey, like, I can't have these conversations. This might be the first time they've thought about this, like, and recognizing that this isn't actually safe for me to have these conversations with my partner. This is why I don't. What would you say to them?
I would say every situation is really individualized and you're not alone. So I would tell anyone who's even questioning this to call helplines because in the first instance, we actually need to validate our experience. And we need to recognize if you're starting to feel this instinct of this doesn't feel safe to me, get advice. Call someone independent, call one of the hotlines and actually get advice and say, this is what I'm feeling. What do you think? Where can I go with this? And because it's not, you can't really have a generalized approach. You really need, in the first instance, someone to validate your experience to give you the strength to go the next step. And sometimes we need the path written for us. We need someone to tell us this is what you do first. Not because you don't want to, but because it is so hard to do. And so you need someone in that instance to provide some direction and control so you feel safe. But I would say if you do question this at all, call one of the hotlines and just get some validation. It's independent. You don't have anyone that you know on the line, so you can have this full conversation. You can be completely open and honest with how you're experiencing the situation, what you think is happening, your fears. That is the first step because you need to know what to do next. You absolutely have to acknowledge it and you have to be able to actually talk to someone and validate that experience. The worst thing is you think through it and you hold on to it, and then you're afraid to speak to someone. You're afraid of potential risk, or you're afraid of judgment, or sometimes we actually just can't put words to it. We genuinely just cannot put the words to it. And so trying to create a space where you can actually call an independent hotline and have a chat to someone is really important to validate your experience. Speaking to someone out loud is really important.
Such great advice because I think, what can happen is that when someone feels alone, social media has become such a space for people to go to. And unfortunately, then what they're accessing is information that is about the context of a healthy relationship. And we know that can actually be really dangerous to apply those type of strategies in a relationship that's not safe. And so it is so important to reach out to a professional, as you said, and to be able to tell your full story without feeling like, as we might do with a friend or a colleague, we might hold back important pieces of information, just to be able to completely be open with that person, knowing it's confidential, knowing that that won't go anywhere, and to be able to get advice for our unique situation.
And that's the first stage in terms of psychological safety is that validation. So I think actually your instinct's telling you something, right? Your instinct's telling you this isn't right. And so calling someone and getting that validation is really, really important to know I can be safe. I can absolutely be safe. I have people who can actually help me and look after me. There is a path forward, but it is really about knowing in the first instance, what do I need to do to be safe? And so getting that advice for someone who is extremely, like I said, it's independent, it's professional. They're very neutral. So there's no judgment, it's confidential. They can provide you advice that will essentially keep you safe in that instance.
That's great advice. Thank you, Chelsea. I wanted to ask you, we talked a lot about myths today, misconceptions, misinformation out there. Are there any key myths that kind of just get on your nerves, like about behavior, or you think, oh, any myths that you've encountered, whether it be on social media or otherwise?
I have seen a general shift in a lot of the narrative on social media, and people are moving away from punishment. And that's in a public forum. However, you do see time and time again that people's default response is punishment procedures. And I would say there's a time and place, particularly when you're talking about safety here. Punishment is necessary, or you're talking about due process. It is necessary. But when we're talking about behavior change, punishment does not teach new behaviors. So it is really important to think the best way to teach new behaviors is someone being able to learn. So again, you're managing the arousal, not managing the behavior. You can never teach someone to swim when they're drowning. In that instance, save them. Breathe with them, be present, co-regulate, or take space because you guys have recognized that's what's really important. Manage arousal first, and then create the capacity to learn and change your behavior.
You know what I'm thinking about when you say that too is I'm thinking about workplace contexts. And quite often, when there's a behavior that a workplace wants to address, they call someone in for a meeting and they don't give them any forewarning. And so they're kind of brought into this meeting and they might have some inclination that something's amiss, but they're not really sure what they're walking into. And so when you were talking, I was just thinking about that, like just that very nature of how we raise the conversation is so important in creating safety.
100%. So if you want someone to be able to listen, and it's really important if they're doing the wrong thing to have these conversations, feedback is really, really important. So if you gave someone in advance information, said, heads up, this is what we're concerned about, let's have a discussion about it. That means they've already thought about it, right? They've thought about what's led to this. They've thought about the behaviors. They've thought about the circumstances. And then what you're going to say in that note in advance, you're going to say, we need to figure out how to resolve this and what support you need, right? So then they've come in prepared with recognizing what are my personal needs? Where do I want to go with this? What are my motivations? So they're going to come far more prepared, and you're going to get far more out of the environment and out of the situation than if you had just said, I need to see you at 2 o'clock. That's it, right? Punishment, if anything, it actually fuels avoidance. So people technically often create new behaviors out of punishment. So a punishment can lead to more maladaptive responses. It's an emotional outburst or it's avoidance, typically. They just learn how to avoid the punisher. In relationships, you can see it quite a bit. So you can see if someone is really negative and hostile, what happens is we don't typically fight back over time. We actually typically just avoid any interaction. And so we just become far more avoidant in our communication style because we just want to avoid that situation ever occurring. And so it just means so much anger and resentment just sits under the surface and actually just builds and builds and builds. So we actually learn how to avoid the punisher. And so it's really important that preparation, if you think about managing arousal, increasing capacity to learn, setting people up for success. If you gave in a workplace people in advance and said, these are my concerns, let's have a chat about it at this time. It'll be myself and so in the room, so they know who's going to be there. There's no surprises. They're going to change their stress response. What actions or what things do you need to help you succeed? Please have a think. That's a far different response. They're going to come in prepared. We've managed their stress response. They're probably still going to be stressed, but at least have taken the time to think through these things. So it's a far more productive meeting. Punishment, if anything, in those instances will only essentially create and shape avoidant behavior. They'll just learn how to avoid you. They'll learn how to go fly under the radar. If anything, you might see more maladaptive toxic behavior function over here and creates more problem. If you want to see behavior change, particularly in the workplace, you need someone to feel safe. You need to provide opportunities and space to teach them the skills. You need to hold them accountable to address their personal needs that facilitate their capability. And you need to reinforce. And so find multiple opportunities for them to feel successful. In that situation, when they come in to a meeting to address behavioral concerns, they can still come in feeling successful because they've said, these are the strategies I need. They can still leave feeling successful because they've been able to articulate what they need and what's getting in the way. So that's going to be far more reinforcing, and they're more likely to come to you and say, hey, I'm really struggling in advance before I have to get another warning. So all of that reinforcement actually facilitates the outcome we actually want, as opposed to punishment that actually creates far more avoidant behavior and more maladaptive behavioral responses that lead to further problems.
That's so important. As you said, I can see how that plays out in relationships as well. So, being able to create that context is so important and give our partner the heads up so that we can have a more productive, regulated conversation together. I want to ask you one last question. If you had a magic wand and you could impart one skill or piece of knowledge on every human, what would it be?
I had a lot. I was actually thinking about this. So I had lots of different things in my head. And I was thinking about all the different strategies and everything. But I do think it's as simple as what sits between fear fear in general, that emotional state of fear and hope, is trust. And the one thing I would say to everyone is it actually takes time to develop trust. So nurture your relationship, practice communication, show up for one another. I do really worry about so much that we're engaging with right now is online, and that we're developing these relationships and these contexts based on these really short snaps of information that we're getting without the whole story. And it actually is really impacting our ability to listen. It's impacting our ability to listen to ourselves and impacting our ability to listen to one another. I would say we actually need to really work on trust with one another. And it takes time and it takes development and practice. And I would say a lot of behavior occurs in the context of fear or hope. So a lot of behavior is fear driven. It's fear. It's a threat response. It's a stress response. Or a lot of behavior occurs because I'm very hopeful. I'm motivated. I'm excited. So behavior occurs often within these two really extreme spectrums. And I would say what sits between that is trust. Trust in myself, trust in the social world around me, trust that people are going to lift me up, they're going to support me, they're going to help me get there. Trust is so, so powerful. And we need to nurture trust. So if we want to actually develop behavior and we want to shape behavior change in our workplace, in our relationships with our children, we need to connect first before we correct. We need to build trust. We need to have a real focus on this connection with one another and the sense of belonging so that I can fall down and get back up. But I'm going to do it in a way that teaches me what to do next, doesn't shame me and punish me, where I just avoid and hide away from the world.
I love that. I think trust is just so fundamental. And as you said, it's something that we build over time in our relationships through those many little acts and interactions over time. Thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge and for sharing it. And, just there's just so much practical information and tools that people can grab and start to implement in their life to create real change. So thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you for having me.
Subscribe for more conversations filled with new insights, inspiration, and practical tools to create a life you love.